Hello, this is FIDE-Master Elliott Liu, and welcome to the video series on how to improve the most by analyzing your own games. So, for players at your level, one of the most important things, in my opinion, as far as how to get better and continually improve, is to be able to go through your own games and identify critical areas or moves that you could have improved. Not only for you, but for your opponent as well. This is a very critical skill that can only help you get better as you gain rating, continue to beat strong players, etc. So the way I'm going to structure this series is it's a multi-part video where I'm going to review a few of my games. I think I chose 3 of them from earlier in my life. And I'm going to do an in-depth analysis of each of these 3 games, dissecting both the opening, middle game, and end game portions of all the games, and identify some key motifs and themes for you guys to look out for when you're analyzing your games as well. Alright, so what you'll find is that 2 of the games are the exact same opening. I did this for a reason. And then the 3rd and final game is a completely different opening. Alright, so without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. For some context, the games in this series were played between 14 and 16 years ago. So quite a little bit ago, from 2001 to 2003. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. So we are going to be looking at the white side of the board for each of these games. Alright. And for players at your level, I would guess that an opening like this one is probably the most popular, or at least one of the most popular. And there are some good reasons for this, and I recommend this opening often for people that I teach. When you're first starting out, right, you learn the basics, you learn the principles. Once you kind of get the fundamentals down, then you're going to start learning basic openings. And it's really important when you first start that your opening choices are relatively simple. Again, just my opinion, but simplicity is never a bad thing, especially, you know, in the 1,000 to 1,200 rating spectrum or range of things. All right, because that allows you not only to begin to build an opening repertoire, but it also allows you to reinforce the fundamental principles of chess while continually developing your play, and also if you wind up in a position where you don't really know what to do, you're not going to lose that quickly because the opening isn't some crazy technical, tactical slugfest, right? Where in those positions, one false move and you could lose immediately. So with this opening here, starting on move 3 with bishop to c4, this is called the Italian game. It's one of the oldest openings in chess. It's one of the most popular amongst all levels of chess, by the way, from beginner all the way up to world championship level, to 2800, believe it or not. And the reason why it's so popular and classical is because it really just follows the principles of chess to a T, where both sides are controlling the center, developing their pieces, castling early, and then going into middle game play. So this allows both players to kind of control the action and not get too crazy early on. Alright, so for those of you watching this who are not familiar with the Italian game and may be interested in picking up something new or learning something else, this is certainly a viable alternative to add to your opening repertoire. Okay, so notice how both sides are making very natural developing moves, bringing their pieces towards the center, preparing to castle. The reason why white plays this c3 move is because the idea is to bolster an eventual central break with the pawn going to d4. Now, some of you might be confused why the knight is not going to be on c3, and that's because in the Italian game there is a specific maneuver which the knight often does, and you will see this in a second. All right. So the knight goes to the center. Okay. We don't want to be developing our knight towards the side of the board on the rim. I'm sure you guys have learned that a knight on the rim is grim. Knights belong where the action is, towards the center of the board. Unlike a piece like a bishop, for example, which is more of a long-range piece, and it works best from far away. The knight works better close up, and so it's usually a good idea, unless there's a concrete reason, that your knight belongs in the center of the board. Okay. So here, this is where black makes the first, I would say, dubious or inaccurate move in the game. He played pawn to b6. All right. So why do you think this is not the best idea in this position? Well, simply put, black should continue with his central development. Right, so b6 followed by bringing the bishop to b7 is what we call a fianchetto in chess, where the bishop gets kind of tucked into this pocket. But in classical openings like this, often the best way to continue is very classically. So black, for example, here should have just continued pawn to d6, creating a nice, healthy central pawn chain like so, and allowing the bishop to develop somewhere along the c8 to h3 diagonal. On b7, it's not really doing all that much, because let's evaluate the scope of this bishop here on b7. All right, so one thing to look for when we think about piece placement, right? This is an important thing to look at in your own games as well. When you're developing your pieces, it's important to ask yourself, okay, where do they belong? Where is the best square that I can develop each of my pieces within reason? So obviously, you can't hope for something unrealistic like all the way down the board to begin with, because that's not feasible. It's not possible, right? But when we're developing our pieces initially, we want to ask ourselves, okay, where do I think the best square is for this bishop? And here in this case, on the b7 square, it doesn't really have that great of a scope on this diagonal. It's kind of indirectly biting against the head of white's central pawn chain, whereas compare that to here, if the bishop was developed to like an e6, for example, where it could directly challenge white's light square bishop on the a2 g8 diagonal, this would probably make a little more sense. A nice centralized piece, challenging white and continuing to control the center. All right. So white continues with development. And now black plays pawn to d6. So if you were going over this game, if this is one of your games, the past 3 moves to reach this position for black should send off some red flags. All right, so on the surface, not much has happened, right? Neither side has traded or lost material. However, structurally, thinking strategically here, what black has done looks very strange, and rightly so. All right. So as a general rule of thumb, when you're developing your bishop, you want to pick a diagonal and stick with it. You don't want to be moving both of these pawns forward. Although it creates a dark square pawn chain, the reason why this is usually not optimal is because of weak squares, right? Weak squares are squares in the position that cannot be protected by pawns, all right? And by putting all of your pawns on one color, what you're doing is you're making the other color square weak, especially if you lose that color bishop. Alright, so for example here, if black were to ever lose or trade off this light square bishop on b7, because all of black's pawns are on dark squares, the light squares would become very weak as a consequence to this. So usually, again, there's always, rules are made to be broken in chess, but as a general rule of thumb, especially early on, you don't want to be putting all of your pawns on a single color, especially if you have if there's a chance that you could lose the opposite colored bishop. All right. So now white retreated the bishop to b3. Why do you think white did that? The reason why white played back to b3 kind of has to do with exactly what I just talked about. So because of black's last structural advances, white realizes that, hey, the light squares have suddenly become more important because my opponent is putting all of their pawns on the dark squares. So as a result, I really want to try to maintain this bishop on c4. And here in this position, if I just make some normal move, I'll just make a move as an example. Okay. Next move, black can play knight to a5, and what this does is it's going to trade off this bishop for this knight, which is going to benefit black in this case, because now he's going to be able to maintain this bishop on b7 without it getting traded off, which kind of justifies putting all of the pawns on the dark squares. Right? So white did not want to allow this. So bishop to b3 was played so that if black plays knight to a5 now, white can simply retreat to c2 and then continue forward with his d4 pawn break ideas. All right. Black played knight to d7. Okay? What do you think white played now? So with each of these games, what I want you guys to do is to try to predict both sides' moves, especially white's in these cases. So what do you think white did here? The answer is pawn to d4. Hopefully this move makes sense, right? To begin with, we're achieving a central break that we kind of wanted in the first place. But on this move in particular, it's actually adding an extra benefit in this position. What do you think it is? The answer is it's directly playing against kind of what black wanted to do in this position. And this is another key point as far as improving your analysis in your own games. Or for that matter, when you're just playing chess in general. As you guys get better and better, you need to start playing against your opponent's plans, right? So after black played knight to d7, he may have the idea of continuing by bringing his knight to c5. Okay, so this pawn to d4 move is not just a central break, but it's also preventing the knight from going to the c5 square. So kind of killing two birds with one stone there. One of the best ways to get better is to find multi-purpose moves like this, for example. You're not just moving aimlessly. Your moves have more than one idea to them or more than one purpose. This makes these moves very, very strong. Okay, so black gets his king out of this annoying diagonal. And now white plays knight to f1. Now at first glance this might look a little strange to you. However, for those of you familiar with the Italian game, you know that this knight maneuver is perfectly normal. So remember how I mentioned at the beginning of this part that the knight coming from b1 would go on a little strange tour, if you will? Well, here it is. What white almost always does in the Italian game is because the pawns are going on c3 and d4. The knight can't go on c3, but instead it kind of hops 3 times to the king side slash the center and redeploys itself to a nice square where it has some attacking ideas. And you'll see this especially in the next game as well. So this is kind of the classic setup for white in the Italian game, or the gioco piano in this case. Alright, so black played knight to a5. What do you think white did? As expected, bishop to c2. Again, we want to maintain that light square bishop because it is a better piece than this knight on a5 at the moment. Black broke in the center with pawn to c5. And now my question for you, what should white do? Do you think white should capture one of these pawns? Do you think white should play pawn to d5? Or should he do something else entirely? The answer is the final choice. Do something else entirely. This is the concept of central tension, and this is an important one. Oftentimes in chess you're faced with a choice of multiple captures or closing the position with a move like pawn to d5, for example. Okay? And one way to help alleviate any confusion that you have when making these decisions is asking yourself this question: whose position benefits from an open game? More open files, more open diagonals. Almost always in general, that is the player who is the attacker. Or if there's not a clear attacker yet, the person with the initiative, or maybe white in general, at least at the beginning of the game, because he has a move advantage, and thus naturally some sort of initiative, however small. Okay? So just because you have multiple options here in the center of the board does not mean at all that you're forced to take one of these two pawns or lock the center down. Alright? It's often better to leave this central tension and continue with your natural development. And if your opponent wants to break the tension and exchange on that square, then so be it. Oftentimes that hurts their position and improves your position. Okay? So in this position I just played knight to g3, continuing with my normal development. Okay, there's no reason why I should be closing the center or I need to take one of these two pawns at this time. I can just continue doing my thing. If black now decides to take some pawns off on d4, this actually helps me. So check it out. Let's say black takes. These come off the board, and this is an extremely nice and pleasant position for white. All right, to begin with, structurally it's nice and open. These bishops are all of a sudden ripping down the king side. Okay, I have ideas of bringing my queen to the powerful h5 square. Who knows, I may have some checkmating threats at some point. And structurally, it's important to note that black's structure has actually been hampered due to this exchange. There is now a weak isolated pawn on d6, which was not the case before. And on top of it, my knight has been brought to a very pleasant square where maybe one day it can go to this nice f5 outpost where it can, you know, do some annoying damage against black's position. Alright, so this is just a case of an example where maintaining the central tension is good in general, and you don't necessarily want to break it, especially if you're the defender. Alright, so after knight to g3, black played pawn to g6. Again, a little dubious here. Black may not have had a clear plan in this position. So what do you think I did as white? The answer is bishop to h6. Why did I play bishop to h6? The answer is not to attack the rook on f8. right? So a lot of players around the 1,000 to 1,200 level will just attack things with no real concrete reason or purpose behind the move. All right. The reason why bishop to h6 is a good move is not that it necessarily attacks the rook, but because it's the best square for the bishop when you're developing it. Right? So don't lose sight, guys. White is playing very simply here. Nothing crazy, nothing complicated. I need to continue and complete my development, and this is the next logical piece that needs to be brought into the game that is not currently in the action yet. And if we look at the choices here for white, you know, it's fairly obvious that the h6 square that was nicely vacated by black's last move pawn to g6 is the best square, right? This is a nice hole on h6. There's no pawn that can get there. It just so happens it's with a tempo attacking the rook on f8, right? So, you know, in this situation, this is a case where the move actually just makes natural sense, and it comes with an extra benefit. All right. Black played rook to e8. And now white played queen to e2. Continuing development once again. And now black decided to break the tension here in the center. And so black took on d4 and then played bishop to h4. Okay, so now things have the chance to get a little more complicated and complex, right? Some things have opened up. The first pawns have finally been exchanged. There is now a half-open e-file. And black has just played this kind of strange, unorthodox move, bishop to h4. Okay, so oftentimes in positions like these, players have a tendency to freak out a little bit and think that they need to, you know, react immediately to moves like this. So the first move that might go through your head, for instance, is knight takes bishop. Oops, excuse me. Which is logical, right? But here's an important point. So here's another thing to look out for when you are analyzing your own games. And again, or just playing chess in general. With every potential trade or capture, you have to evaluate who gets the better of that exchange in the form of piece placement, right? So although a knight was traded for a bishop, what just happened? It's as if black was allowed to bring his queen to the h4 square, right? Which is actually a pretty decent square for this queen, where now it's applying pressure to both my center e4 pawn as well as my bishop on h6, which was nicely placed there. So I don't necessarily want to allow my opponent the ability to develop the queen like this, right? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So why do I need to take this bishop? I mean, the only reason why I would need to take is if there was a concrete threat tactically, right? Of which there's not. So, as white here, I just simply played rook to d1. Ignoring things, right? Completing my development, making things very classical, bringing the rooks towards the middle files just like you're taught. Okay? No need to make rash decisions. And ironically enough, it's black that ends up freaking out a little bit here, clearly not having a plan, decides to take on g3. Alright, so check that out, guys. Compare this position to this one right here. So in two moves, black has moved his bishop to h4 and taken my knight on g3. Right? In the meantime, I've simply just developed my rook to d1, which is where I wanted to develop it in the first place. So as a result, I've actually gained some additional time now in this position, which of course helps me. Alright, so take, queen to e7. So I think here it's fair to say that at this stage of the game, the opening has officially finished. And the reason why I say that is because not because of what move it is or how many pieces have been taken, but because, at least from White's perspective, I have fully completed my development, right? Every piece now has been moved and brought into the game, and that often signals the end of the opening stage. Okay? So in the middle game, one of the most important things to look for when you're playing or when analyzing your own games is the idea of piece placement. The reason why the middle game is the hardest part of chess for players of all levels is because oftentimes not a whole lot of stuff is forced, right? There are a lot of things you need to think through strategically, which involve creating more long-term plans and just thinking about yourself as opposed to some tactical sequences which could happen, early on or in the end game, for example. All right. So in the middle game, it's all about positional maneuvering and maximizing and optimizing your piece placement. Okay. And the way I like to think about this, to try to make it as simple as possible, is I just like to ask myself the question. Once I've developed my pieces, I literally will just go one by one and say, okay, with this piece, is it on the best possible square right now, realistically, right? So it's kind of combining both idealism plus realism at the same time, right? So just because we have a piece does not mean that we can get it to the ideal square immediately. Here's what I mean. So let's take this knight, for example, on f3. I ask myself, is it on the best possible square in the position? Well, the answer technically is no, because yeah, I would love to have my knight on c7, right, where I'm forking the rook on a8 and the rook on e8. But how realistic is that to get it there in a logical way? Not really, right? So in this case, the knight on f3 is pretty much ideally placed. There's nowhere that it can go or really wants to go right now where it's better placed than where it is. So everything is fine with this knight. So I'll go through piece by piece, all right? And you can do this visually with this game now too. And what you'll find is that pretty much all of White's pieces are optimally placed except one. See if you can figure out which one that is. The answer is this queen on e2. So this queen on e2 is it is on this half-open file. All right? And there's actually a very good square that it realistically can get to where it provides a lot more punch than where it currently is. So see if you can figure out where that is. Okay, so what I realized during the game is, well, I first asked, okay, where is my opponent weak right now? Obviously, there's no material imbalance really. But what I realized is that black is especially weak on the king side and the dark squares in particular, right? So I have this bishop on h6, which is a monster. And the reason why I'm calling it a monster is because it's unopposed by any of black's pieces. Black's dark square bishop is gone, so this piece is going to be a nightmare for black, and it's very difficult to dislodge it. Okay, so I want to focus my energy on the king side dark squares. And right now this bishop is pretty much ideally placed, right? Raking across some key squares already. So I don't really want to move this piece. So combine that piece with what I was saying about the queen earlier, and what move do you think I played? The answer is queen to d3. Okay, so here's another good example of a multi-purpose move. I am getting out of this half-open e-file, right? I am putting my queen as a battery on a new d file with ideas of maybe opening things up at some point with pawn takes pawn. And the kicker of all of it, my queen is redeploying to c3, where it's very powerfully placed because now I have a definite threat against black's position, notably the very simple pawn takes pawn discovered check, followed by hopefully some sort of checkmate on g7. See that, guys? So the way of thinking is kind of how I got the queen from here to here. And there's nothing that my opponent could have really done to stop this either. Alright, so now my opponent played pawn to f6 to obviously try to stop any shenanigans on this diagonal. Okay, and now here's the next important point in the middle game. As things develop, as you continue to improve your pieces, things change. Chess is dynamic, right? Especially structurally. So when the pawn structure changes, you must adapt as well. What could have been a good idea a move earlier because of one small pawn move could be completely different now, and that idea might be nullified and might not be nearly as strong. So after black's move pawn to f6 here in this position, my scope changes a little bit because, you know, there's no concrete way to get my queen to g7, for example, right? Especially without black's queen on e7 being there. There's no, realistic way to do that. So as a result, my bishop on h6 is kind of eh. It looks pretty, but it's not really doing a whole lot. I also don't want to get it trapped there on h6. For example, if black ever has an idea like pawn to g5, I don't want to get it stuck there. Okay? So put those things together, and what I decided to do was redeploy it to another square, right, to kind of adapt to my new plan. So in this position, I played bishop to f4. The reason why I played this move was because I am now focusing my attention on this weak, isolated, backwards d6 pawn, right? Where now I have multiple pieces putting pressure on that d6 pawn with the idea, of course, of opening up the d file at some point. Right, so see how I adapted there? At first, I was trying to poke weaknesses on the king side, but because of the structure changed from last move with pawn to f6, bishop to f4 is a move that makes sense with a new target. So black finally completed his development by moving his rook logically to the centralized d8 square. Okay, and now my next move is a little advanced, but this is again something important to watch out for in your analysis. Okay, so now that I've kind of maximized my piece placement for the time being, I really want to try to play against ideas or moves that my opponent may have. And remember how I mentioned this pawn to g5 move a move ago? I still don't really want to have black play this move no matter how ugly it really looks, because I like having this pressure against the d6 pawn. So I want to keep my bishop on this diagonal if possible, but there's no really good way to stop black from playing pawn to g5 because I don't have a pawn that can go to h4, for example, to stop it. But what I can do is make room for my bishop to retreat when black plays pawn to g5. Put 2 and 2 together, and that's why I played pawn to g4, which actually is another multi-purpose move. So not only does it create a pocket for my bishop to retreat when black plays pawn to g5, but it kind of forces black to play pawn to g5, because if he doesn't do it, I will. The reason why I'm going to do it is because if I'm allowed to play pawn to g5, this could be really dangerous and annoying for him, right? Because now I have these ideas again of ripping open this c3 h8 diagonal with discovery tricks, right? And g5 is going to serve as the breaking point on this f6 pawn, which would not be pleasant for black to deal with. So not only does g4 create room, but it kind of forces black to play g5, again, putting all of his pawns on one, almost on one color, and structurally making it very unpleasant for black. Okay, so this concludes part 1 of the video series of how to improve analyzing your own games and what to look for in all 3 stages of chess. Make sure to check out part 2 for this game's continuation. Thank you for watching.